the line continued to hold. The Soviet attacks repeatedly broke upon the drained, frozen, and casualty-decimated ranks of soldiers from East Prussia, Westphalia, Bavaria, and the Rhineland. As a Soviet attack supported by tanks penetrated a thinly defended wood and ground forward toward battalion headquarters, a Prussian Feldwebel attempted to bring an anti-tank gun into the line, but he was hindered by the thick limbs and stumps that prevented him from successfully positioning the weapon. Followed by bursts from a Soviet machine gun, he fought through waist-deep snow to a nearby artillery piece, the crew of which had all become casualties moments earlier. The Feldwebel had never before laid hands on this type of weapon, and 2 grenadiers sprang forward to assist him. Rapidly adjusting for range and windage, he aimed and fired. It must work, and it did. The first tank rocked to a halt and burst into flames, followed quickly by another, and for the moment the Russian attack faltered. The Soviet lines now all but surrounded the weakened and exhausted battalion, which extended like an island of resistance deep into enemy territory. The battalion had successfully repelled the attackers and succeeded in keeping the supply route clear. Blackened hulks of destroyed enemy tanks along the perimeter bore mute testimony to the heavy fighting that had taken place within the narrow confines of the sector. During one night, an assault team successfully destroyed 4 Soviet bunkers and an enemy anti-tank position, but became cut off and isolated in the ensuing firefight. After 9 days and nights behind enemy lines, with no rest under the unforgiving, freezing sky, 2 battle-exhausted corporals reached our lines at dawn, carrying a wounded comrade. They had wrapped him in a shelter quarter and, thrusting a pole through the knotted ends, carried him between them, moving among the enemy during the hours of darkness and burying themselves in snowbanks during the day. Upon reaching our lines, they collapsed with exhaustion, regaining consciousness hours later. Refusing an offer to be transported to the rear for rest, they staggered to their feet and set out in the direction of their company. The following night, their company assaulted and overran an enemy bunker complex with the 2 men at the front, destroying the last enemy bastion in the sector. The weeks of battle in the swamps north of Smerdania called upon the last reserves of strength and morale. A forest war, time-consuming and slow, brought endless fighting against a vastly superior enemy of unending strength. Enduring against the worst possible conditions exacted a heavy toll on the grenadiers, artillerymen, engineers, and flak crews. The main battlefront continued to run along a bulge in the line held by the regiment. The 7th Company was positioned with the left wing extending from north to south within the narrow depression of the Lesna streambed. The fragile line then curved to the right with the front facing south, up to the forest's edge. The line disappeared into the dense forest, running for several hundred meters in a straight line, then curving again to the right, facing west and southwest. Within this extended salient, about 30 meters behind the line, was the company headquarters, consisting of little more than an entrenched hut covered with earth and snow. An adjustment in the defensive line had been conducted 2 nights previously, during which the right wing had been withdrawn, shortening the line to lessen the growing threat of being isolated and annihilated. Between the lines was a no-man's land of dense thickets and evergreens. On the 15th of February, all was quiet along the line. A sense of discomfort had descended upon the isolated platoons holding a thin front. Seldom was it possible to hear only the deathly whisper of a winter wind passing through the treetops. Almost always the front exhibited signs of life, be it from the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle or the methodical pounding of the Maxim positions as they probed our defences. The day before, the Soviets had probed the salient along the perimeter. Wherever they appeared, one could observe their ghastly silhouettes through the thick forest and deep snow at a distance of less than 50 meters. They were either destroyed or repulsed. Despite the apparent absence of the enemy, it was strongly felt that the Soviets were coming. The salient was reinforced at the expense of the left and right wings. 2 heavy machine guns were brought into position and carefully concealed in the defences. The sector, where the line extended beyond the earthworks to turn sharply to the right, was reinforced by felling trees and stacking heavy timbers. At this location, I directed that one heavy machine gun be situated at the turn on the line, affording it maximum field of fire. A squad led by an Obergefreiter positioned a light machine gun in the sector centre. The grenadiers dug in, 2 shivering Lancers occupying each snow hole, situated 10 to 15 metres apart. The night remained brutally cold, following a day of heavy labour in the snow. Their feet were stiff in their frozen boots, and the grenadiers grew numb with cold and exhaustion. Huddled within the damp and freezing confines of the primitive earthworks, they had little or no protection from the cold that settled into the snow holes, tormenting them. Suddenly the heavy MG broke the silence with an ear-splitting roar, followed by a scream. "Alarm! Ivan!" The Obergefreiter squeezed the trigger of the MG-42, firing quick, short bursts into the twilight, joined by the heavy MG on the wood's edge. Carbines cracked between MG bursts. The low drumming of Soviet Maxim guns responded, joined by the high, shrill blasts of Russian submachine guns. Rounds whistled through the evergreens, sending branches laden with snow to the earth, and bullets carved long trails in the snow piled before the defenders' positions. The Feldwebel at the heavy MG lay prone alongside the machine gun with his carbine at his shoulder, rapidly working the bolt and firing one clip after another. The entire woods swarmed with Bolshevists. We first observed them 30 metres before our position, filtering through the undergrowth, snapping branches and ice breaking beneath dozens, perhaps hundreds of Russian boots. The machine guns roared, joined by submachine guns and carbines, unheard above the pounding automatic weapons and grenade detonations. The shouts of "Hurrah! Hurrah!" could be heard during split-second lulls in the gunfire. After several seconds of firing, the shouts turned to screams, as the dead, wounded and dying collapsed in the snow before our ranks. Bodies clad in earth-brown and white camouflage uniforms lay heaped in front of the machine gun positions, and more Russians filled the gaps our steaming weapons left in the charging masses. The forest before us had become a concentrated killing ground. There was no need to search out targets as the Soviets threw themselves toward our line, jumping, dodging, shooting and screaming. They pressed forward. Despite the overwhelming terror, the grenadiers remained in their positions, refusing to panic. Like a training exercise, the Lancers controlled and sustained their fire, able to observe the field directly before them, unconscious of what might have occurred to their right or left. Some carbines had fallen silent. The situation became more perilous as the Soviet attack collapsed only 6 metres before the machine guns. The forests echoed with the roar of battle for an hour. Seeing no end to the waves of attackers, I desperately ordered our last reserve, a tiny squad of 4 men, to prepare for action. At that moment, I received a plea from the platoon on our left for reinforcements. The line faced imminent collapse, although the light machine gun continued to fire incessantly, its bursts accompanied by the detonation of hand grenades hurled forward by desperate grenadiers. The dead and wounded filled the forest. Our losses were relatively light, 2 dead and 3 wounded, but were irreplaceable. The firing on our right flank lessened, finally falling silent as the Soviet attack ground to a halt. The defenders, consisting of 4 or 5 weary grenadiers, remained on alert, fingers on their weapon triggers that slowly cooled in the frosty air. Suddenly, movement was observed near the Soviet line. An extremely tall Russian rose from the snow-blanketed forest, shouted unintelligible commands, and motioned with a raised arm to the left. A new wave of attackers swarmed in the indicated direction. The ranks of oncoming Soviets collapsed in the fire of the heavy machine gun, and the tall Russian fell among them. The attack was finally broken. The Bolsheviks remained bogged in their tracks, firing from snow holes, behind shattered branches and ragged stumps, and from concealed positions within the evergreen forest. Slowly their fire weakened, leaving only the screams of their wounded, who cried and thrashed in agony before our line. For more than 2 hours they had thrown themselves against the position defended by grenadiers from East Prussia, the Rhineland, Bavaria, the Pfalz, Baden and Württemberg. I became aware that the heavy machine gun had fallen silent and that carbine fire had subsided. At the machine gun position, The crew lay slumped beside their gun. The corporal lay as if asleep behind the smoking weapon, the butt still pressed firmly against his shoulder. His head slumped forward, his whitewashed helmet resting against the smoking feed tray where ammunition belts fed into the chamber. He had been the last man in his crew. Slowly, the cries of the wounded faded to silence. The stillness was broken only by the muffled sounds of Russians crawling back to their lines. Snow began to fall, and I realized it was already past midday. The forest had taken on a new appearance during the assault. Trees had been downed by small arms fire. The earth lay torn and pockmarked, branches and limbs hung from ragged stumps. Evergreens in the line of fire had been stripped of foliage and appeared as bare stakes in the snow. The only colour in the frozen wasteland was the scarlet blood covering the dead and dying before our guns. The Soviets began firing mortars, their hollow thumps echoing through the forest. Their attack had been repulsed only moments before our forces would have collapsed under the waves of attackers. In the final minutes they would have broken our line, but their strength had been exhausted as well. A distance of approximately 80 metres of our line was held only by thick forests. The sound of carbine fire was no longer heard from its depths. We had repulsed the assault of a Soviet battalion, with few surviving to return to their own lines. We later risked sniper fire and ventured out a short distance beyond our defences to survey the carnage, and the grenadiers counted the dead. More than 160 corpses lay before the defences, most of them in front of the heavy machine gun in the earthworks on the edge of the forest, and scattered before the machine gun that had been manned by the senior corporal. The body of the tall Russian who had led the last fatal assault was also found lying in the snow. Thrust in his field belt we found a Cossack dagger, apparently carried by the soldier through a number of past battles. The dagger bore a thin layer of rust, and the blade and sheath were sticky with a recent coat of blood. Filed into the handle were 12 notches of obvious significance. Panzer from right, Panzer from front, Panzer from left. From all three directions, the Soviet armour, mostly T-34S, attempted to smash through the division's defences. Regardless of how many of the steel giants exploded and burned under the murderous fire from our concealed pack positions, more always rolled forward to replace them. The front was severed through the thick forests between Klosterdorf and Smerdania. The sound of battle grew to a crescendo. A small combat group from Grenadier Regiment Drexel continued to hold out between the tree stumps, crouching in snow holes and behind hastily constructed log barricades. They were supported by a puck from the 14th Panzerjäger Company of Grenadier Regiment 436, commanded by Obergefreiter Kiermaier, one of the old veterans of the regiment. Through the sound of battle, his experienced senses detected the high pitch of tank rounds coming from the right. From their position, they observed only the impenetrable maze of tree stumps, piles of frozen logs, and a massed tangle of branches and roots against which any attack would falter. The farmer's son from Lower Bavaria continued to wait with the patience of a hunter, staring into the forest with the eyes of a lynx from behind the steel protection shield of the anti-tank gun. He was joined by the others in the gun crew, and they lay deathly still on the snow, attempting to penetrate the frozen jungle with their eyes. The location of the oncoming Soviet troops was at last betrayed by the movement of a steel colossus grinding through the trees. Kiermaier motioned the others to hold their fire, allowing the enemy to approach closer as the oncoming waves unknowingly proceeded into the killing zone. Behind the first tank they discerned a second, then a third, a fourth, accompanied by ranks of Russian infantry moving ghost-like through the trees. Kiermaier remained unmoving at his position behind the gun shield, his eye now pressed to the rubber eyepiece of the gun sight. He centered the last tank in the crosshairs, and with a strong fist, firmly pressed the firing button. The round exploded from the barrel of the pack, striking the tank and spraying the interior of the turret with fire and red-hot steel. A thick column of smoke rose from the burning tank as the fuel and ammunition exploded with a roar. The steel carcass effectively blocked the withdrawal route of the foremost tanks as it showered the surrounding forest with splinters and glowing ashes. Kiermaier had already drawn a bead on his next target, and with 2 more shots, the second tank burned brightly. The other tanks opened fire with cannons and machine guns, firing blindly into the thick undergrowth, unable to locate the source of the fire. The third and fourth began to burn and explode. Another round from the hidden puck destroyed the transmission of the fifth, and the crew abandoned the tank and escaped the small arms fire to flee to the rear with the retreating infantry. This gun crew later destroyed 3 more tanks, a total of 8 for the day. When the regimental commander received the report of the destruction of the tanks and the repulse of the enemy attack, he recommended the gun leader be awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Unfortunately, the battle group was authorized only 1 Knight's Cross to be awarded during this period, and the decoration was awarded to a general serving north of Smerdenia under General Lindemann. Kiermaier was later awarded the Iron Cross for the destruction of the tanks, which resulted in the attack being repulsed, and Oberstleutnant Drechsel offered a promotion to the gun leader. Kiermaier refused the opportunity, fully aware at this point in the war that the chances of survival remained greatest for those who remained with the soldiers whom they had fully trusted and served with throughout the campaign. The promotion would have provided him a more prestigious rank. However, it might have resulted in his removal from the gun crew to serve in another capacity. On the 20th of February, infantry regiments 405 and 408 attacked from the north in an attempt to cut off the enemy penetration on the Corduroy Road. The attack resulted in heavy fighting with severe losses, and in the evening the regiments succeeded in closing the gap in the line and mopping up the remaining Russian resistance. The roadway was free from point 38.9 to Klosterdorf, but our forces no longer possessed the strength to cut off and destroy any Soviet penetrations. Throughout the 10 days of heavy fighting, the enemy had suffered such severe losses that an attack northward towards Smerdenia was launched, and this successful offensive enabled us to stabilize the front, permitting the corps to withdraw the badly damaged divisions from the line. On the 28th of February, Group Lindemann, badly battered and weakened by casualties, was temporarily replaced. We were advised that the infantry regiments were to be changed in name to grenadier regiments. Perhaps the High Command desired to demonstrate that through the use of hand grenades in close combat, the title grenadier would show recognition for special merit or ability in battle. It remained irrelevant to us if we were to be referred to as grenadiers or infantrymen, as our skill in using the grenades remained unchanged, whether we were called grenadiers or not. Following the desperate battle in which the Soviet thrust to Gaitolovo was repelled, we were relieved from our positions by the 12th Luftwaffe Field Division and transferred to a quiet sector of the front. The newly christened grenadiers marched in long columns from the log barricades on the line over the corduroy roads that cut through the swamps toward the rear. It had become necessary to constantly change the location of the rough-hewn roads and trails, as they came under frequent mortar and artillery fire when discovered by the enemy, who lay only a short distance away. The lancers marched in single file, bearing heavy equipment on their shoulders, occasionally assisted by the sturdy Siberian ponies that were always present among our ranks. The division headquarters was transferred to Poprutka, and the new division sector was concentrated around the area of Mordam. There we remained undisturbed, recovering from the ordeal of Gaitolovo, until the 30th of June, when we were again replaced by the 225th Infantry Division. This pause in activity took us to the area of Lyuban Shapki Ushaki, where we were able to concentrate on training the replacement personnel. Following the training period, the division was sent back into the line, again to a relatively quiet sector on the northwest front of the Pogostia pocket. During the rest period of July 1943, the regimental commander, Oberst Kienzmiller, took quarters in a small house with a blue-painted front veranda. Among the tiny, scattered villages of rough-hewn wooden buildings, a painted dwelling remained the exception, and the small but attractive forest house became the evening meeting place for the regimental staff. Oberst Kienzmiller, 50 years old, had received a disabling wound during World War I as a young lieutenant that had rendered his left arm stiff at the elbow. As a result of this wound, he normally carried this arm held in a rigid, formal pose behind his back, somewhat reminiscent of paintings of our Prussian ancestor, Frederick the Great. The commander's birthday was celebrated during one of the midsummer evenings, and the junior officers of the regiment had prepared a surprise for him. We had previously coordinated with the soldiers' radio program Ursula, whose broadcasts were heard every evening in this sector, to wish the Oberst a happy birthday and to dedicate a special broadcast to him. As we gathered for the impromptu birthday celebration, the broadcast suddenly announced that the lieutenants from one of our grenadier regiments convey their best wishes to their commander on his birthday, and on this occasion they have requested the following song be played in his honour. With these words came the haunting melody of the popular hit Der Nachtgespenst. The commander's initial reaction to our selection was to conceal his surprise at this broadcast, and he characteristically attempted to convey the impression that he was less than pleased. Of course, he was impressed that we would so honour him with our efforts. However, it was apparent that our selection did not exactly fit his taste. He openly stated that the Fährberliner Reitermarsch would have been more to his liking. We remained, nevertheless, flattered by his reaction. During the following days, the enemy activity increased along our sector. Soviet aircraft again became a nuisance, overflying our positions at all hours, dropping loads of bombs and firing on vehicles and troop concentrations with board weapons. With the growing sound of aircraft engines, the Lancers instinctively threw themselves into trenches or sought shelter among the trees. Every evening the thunder of artillery would increase noticeably, and the distant crack of detonating shells rolled over the treetops. One July evening, following a briefing at the regimental headquarters, I noticed Oberst Kienzmiller standing alone near the edge of the blue veranda. Gazing into the distance toward the north, from where the nightly artillery barrage was growing in intensity, he concentrated on a row of white flares slowly drifting through the darkening sky on the horizon. Although he used words barely perceptible from where I was standing, I heard him softly say to himself that the Bohemian corporal was certain to lose his war. I did not consider this a denouncement, nor did I consider this to reflect a defeatist attitude from my commander. His words simply confirmed to me what all of us had begun strongly to suspect. The colonel was a fine professional officer and a great soldier. He was, as so many of us at the front had clearly come to recognize, an absolute realist. 4 weeks later, he was dead. A rumour reached our position that several members representing a front theatre group, on tour for the entertainment of the soldiers, were present at the division headquarters. Among the theatre personnel were several women, news that immediately captured our full attention. The commander of Grenadier Regiment 436, Oberst Drexel, had offered to take full responsibility for the safety and protection of the theatre members in exchange for a special presentation of their programme for his regiment. The division adjutant, Major I.G. Geyer, was less than enthusiastic about the prospects of permitting the ladies for whom he was responsible out of his sight. Major Geyer was sensitive to the fact that within the immediate vicinity of the division staff were our combat forces, which consisted of 3 grenadier regiments, an artillery regiment, various support battalions and administrative units, and the myriad staffs required to administer the duties of an army. Like the good staff officer that he was, Geyer was aware of the problems that could develop with his acceptance of this proposal. When it became known to the junior officers that the theatre group had already exceeded their allotted time with the division and that Oberst Drexel's proposal had thus far been unsuccessful, a plan was formulated and presented to Uncle Sepp Drexel to liberate the 2 ladies from the clutches of the division staff. The assault group set out during the night, properly outfitted with lances and swords, wearing the customary beards and period costumes to fit the occasion. At the forefront marched Uncle Sepp, closely followed by a raucous band of Landsknechte, who stormed forward like the wild army of Wotan and Florian Geyer, fully prepared to rescue the damsels at any cost. The band swept into the enemy lair, unrolled a parchment that proclaimed the official liberation of the maidens, and, to the accompaniment of cheers and the swinging of broadswords, escorted the ladies through the forest darkness to the safety of our own camp. The liberation of the damsels brought us a night of socializing, accompanied by some drinking and song, and thereafter the ladies were returned to the confines of the division. The quiet sector of the front was soon to take on a different character. On the morning of the 22nd of July, our line came under heavy artillery fire in the area 2½ kilometres southwest and 3½ kilometres northwest of the Pogostia railway station. After an extended bombardment from Stalin's organs and mortar fire, the enemy struck with full force upon the section held by the 3rd Battalion, Grenadier Regiment 437. According to prisoner interrogations obtained following the assault, the enemy had planned to coordinate this attack with a major assault on the north front to encircle our forces. This was to be accomplished by conducting a pincer movement from the east, which would then swing south to sever the extended salient in which our main battle line was located. This area was officially referred to by the German staff as the Sappenkopf. Despite the heavy fire of our own artillery directed onto the assault line, the enemy was able to achieve a breakthrough 250 metres wide and 300 to 400 metres deep to the west of the Pogostia railway station by 12:15. This breakthrough, accomplished by overwhelming numerical forces, had been concentrated on the positions held by the 10th Company, Grenadier Regiment 437. The attack remained unsuccessful against positions held by the 2 other companies in this sector. Through the use of our reserve, it was possible to push the Soviet forces out of the left flank of the pocket and to restore this area of the main battle line by 15:35, during which time the enemy was forced to abandon numerous dead and wounded on the battlefield. Simultaneously, the 3rd Company, Grenadier Regiment 437, was successful in counter-attacking along the right flank. Despite heavy enemy artillery that attempted to block the area to the south of the Soviet penetration, the remaining enemy forces were either forced to withdraw or were isolated and annihilated. The enemy regrouped. During the lull in which he was preparing for another assault, the Lancers hastily evacuated their wounded. Cases of hand grenades were brought forward on pony carts for distribution. Machine gunners replenished gleaming belts of ammunition and cleared their weapons of sand and grit. Someone appeared with a container of cold coffee and a large canvas bag full of black bread, which was hungrily devoured while the forces were on the move. Medical personnel bandaged the lightly wounded, who then shouldered their weapons and returned to their platoons. Incoming mortar rounds announced an end to the temporary pause on the killing ground. The Soviets then launched another stubborn attack against both flanks of the Sappenkopf area, again targeting the Pogostia station, and after 1½ hours of fierce fighting succeeded in breaking through the Sappenkopf position at 1800. Again, our weakening reserve units were pushed into a counter-attack, and were successful in severing the enemy lines for the second time within several hours. Despite concentrated artillery and barrages from Stalin's organs, the 3rd Company, Grenadier Regiment 437, cleared the enemy from our lines to a distance 2 kilometres west of the Pogostia station by 20:45. With this successful counterattack, a major thrust from the enemy was spoiled. The enemy plan was revealed and confirmed by interrogations of captured enemy personnel, as well as through the numerous maps and supporting documents found on the battlefield. The enemy had suffered relatively heavy losses, and the regimental situation report contained the list of enemy casualties: 20 prisoners taken, 2 officers, 69 confirmed enemy dead in the main battle line, 15 officers, 100 confirmed enemy dead in front of the main battle line, 270 estimated enemy dead in front of the main battle line and captured material, 5 heavy machine guns, 12 light machine guns, 2 pistols, 6 rifles, 63 submachine guns, 2 anti-tank launchers, and 3 field telephones. After repelling the last assault before darkness enveloped the combatants, the front fell silent. During the night, the customary distant voices could be heard from the Soviet lines as we prepared for the ordeal that we were sure to face with the dawn. As the sun rose over the treetops, the front remained suspiciously quiet. No enemy movement was reported. To our relief, We experienced no further enemy activity prior to being replaced on the line by the 121st Infantry Division. Enemy propaganda leaflets were dropped from a Soviet fog crow over Infantry Regiment 437 on the 30th of July 1943. For us, the war is now over. Comrades! We, Feldwebel Ludwig Herbert, Obergefreiter Karl Beer, Gefreiter Gustav Goltzer, Soldat Eugen Gieser, Soldat August Bartel, Soldat Emil Kuhlen, from the 10th Company, IR 437, were taken prisoner during the 22nd of July 1943 Russian attack. We were correctly handled by the officers and soldiers of the Red Army. The wounded received immediate medical attention. The Russian soldiers even shared their cigarettes with us. For us, the war is now over. We need no longer fear the Russian artillery. We know now that all that we were told by the battalion commander, Major Schmidt, the company commander of the 9th Company, Hauptmann Lindner, the company commander of the 10th Company, Lieutenant Mika, Feldwebels Bienau and Einlener, about the atrocities and mistreatment we would experience should we fall into Russian hands were all lies. These ridiculous statements have been proven false by the excellent treatment we have received since becoming prisoners of the Soviet Union. In late July 1943, I was commanding the assault reserve of the regiment in the Maluksa position. One afternoon, I was requested to report to the command post, where it was explained to me that a soldier condemned to death was to be executed by firing squad. Having received the appalling assignment to carry out the execution, I requested from the battalion adjutant the details regarding the case. If I was to be responsible for the death of one of our own, to ease my own conscience, I desired to know why such a severe penalty had been imposed on the soldier. It was explained to me that a member of the 5th Company had observed a soldier steal a package from the postal transport en route to the platoon, from which he removed cigarettes and food for his own use. It was widely known throughout our ranks that a theft of this nature constituted a serious crime in the German army, for which a severe punishment could be imposed. Later, while standing alone on sentry duty with the perpetrator, the soldier who had witnessed the theft informed the culprit that he had seen the incident and that he should immediately return the stolen goods, or that all details of the theft would be reported. The thief, obviously fearing the repercussions of his crime should it be made known, quickly sprang to the machine gun, pivoted the gun on its lafette, and shot the witness with a full burst from the automatic weapon at close range. He then tossed several hand grenades, which were always primed and within arm's reach of the machine gun, and feigned an engagement of Russian reconnaissance troops before the position. The wounded soldier did not die immediately, but was taken to the medical station with severe chest and abdominal wounds, which shortly proved to be fatal. He temporarily regained consciousness, however, and was able to report the incident to the medical officer. The murderer was arrested, and a summary court-martial was convened. Subsequently, the perpetrator was sentenced to die by firing squad. There was no shortage of volunteers to serve for this purpose, and a platoon from the victim's company provided the necessary number of riflemen to carry out the sentence. The following morning, I began making the meticulous preparations for the execution. From the regimental headquarters, I received the precise official details of how it was to be conducted. Army regulations required that a 2-meter stake be anchored vertically in the ground, supported from the rear. If possible, a retaining wall was to be located a short distance behind the stake for the purpose of stopping the bullets. Not far from the regimental headquarters, I constructed a small sandy berm against which a low retaining wall was built. The firing squad quietly assembled, accompanied by a Feldwebel with a Luger pistol in his right hand. In the event the condemned did not die immediately, he would be required to fire the killing shot. As prescribed in the regulations, a medical officer was present. I quietly briefed the firing squad on how the procedure was to be conducted. As I spoke, I scanned the faces of the soldiers who were to squeeze the triggers for any sign of nervousness or hesitation. The soldiers followed my orders and stood silently in ranks at their prescribed location, rifles at rest. The execution was ordered to be carried through at exactly 1500. Several minutes prior to the time specified, the regimental legal officer arrived with a number of field police. Stumbling unsteadily among them was the condemned, who, with an ashen face, was still clad in our field-grey uniform, stripped of rank and all insignia. Without hesitation, several of the field police escorted the condemned forward, where he was quickly bound to the stake with his hands tied behind his back at the wrists. Wordlessly, a blindfold was placed over his eyes and tied securely behind his head. The escort then distanced themselves from the condemned, and the division chaplain stepped forward and spoke softly to him. The silence lay heavy in the air. The condemned appeared to strain against the cords binding him to the stake. His head dropped upon his breast as the chaplain whispered words unheard by the firing squad. From several kilometres' distance on the front, the customary shell bursts and isolated rifle shots floated softly over the open ground to reach our ears. Despite the unquestionable guilt of the condemned and the necessity of carrying through our assignment, emotions remained mixed when we were faced with the unthinkable task of shooting one of our own, of firing on the uniform worn so long by all present. Thoughts raced through my mind. I was fully aware that in another place and another time, this man would most likely have lived a full and productive life, and that his life had been stolen from him, like millions of others, by the folly and temerity of those beyond our power. My thoughts went to his family, his mother, father, and siblings. I asked myself if they would ever learn the true fate of their loved one, of how he met his end in Russia. The laws of the front were harsh and unforgiving, and in this case the sentence could only be considered as just. The execution squad remained in position opposite the bound soldier. I glanced about at those present, and I observed that all witnesses and participants had fixed their eyes upon the man to die. The firing squad exhibited grim, tired faces, void of emotion. The legal officer and the medical officer stood a short distance away, well beyond the line of fire, hands clasped behind their backs, faces expressionless. Only the Feldwebel, with a pistol in hand, looked at me expectantly. I found myself looking at my watch. At exactly 1500, as if on the parade field, the commands came from my throat. Zur Salve, hoch, Legtern, gebt Feuer! With a roar, the rifle bullets tore through the breast of the condemned. He rocked back against the stake, blood erupting from the wounds. He collapsed against the cords as all strength and consciousness left his body and hung silently against the stake for several seconds. The medical officer strode forward to examine the still form. Despite the severity of the wounds, he detected a pulse and looked first at me, then shifted his glance to the Feldwebel to motion him forward. The Feldwebel stepped forward, raised his arm, and fired point-blank into the head of the condemned, just behind the ear. Again the medical officer approached, examined the now lifeless form, and called to the police escort. 2 men loosened the form from the stake. Others then stepped forward, and the body was laid in a wooden box. Without another word, they disappeared in a cloud of dust as they drove away. Having put that unforgettable experience into words, I must also state that this incident was the only such case that I experienced throughout the years on the Eastern Front. Never again was I even remotely aware of another incident of theft among the Lancers. In August 1943, our division relieved the 121st Infantry Division, which had suffered heavily during the fighting on the Neva along a 10-kilometre front. Since the 2nd of August, Grenadier Regiment 436 had come under the command of the 5th Mountain Division, which had experienced numerous assaults by an enemy heavily reinforced with armour and had suffered high casualties. The days prior to the 132 Days Division's arrival on the line had remained relatively quiet. However, on the 11th of August, the enemy launched a major attack. Attacking in regimental strength against the Poritche bridgehead, the Soviets succeeded in breaking through the thinly held line, but were later repulsed with heavy losses following our counterattack. A second assault launched in the evening was again beaten back with support from our heavy artillery. During the night, the troops prepared for follow-on fighting. While attempting to resupply the exhausted units, the Lancers came under constant bombing attacks as Soviet aircraft overflew the lines. Although the Ratters were lost to sight in the darkness, their droning would grow rapidly in intensity. Then they would bank and sweep over the positions, dropping loads of bombs and tearing the earth with bursts from their machine guns. On the 12th of August, at exactly 0900, the enemy launched an attack along the entire front in full strength. It consisted of numerous waves of brown-clad infantrymen heavily supported by artillery fire, tanks, and overwhelming air power. These attacks in company, battalion, and regimental strength, which lasted an entire day, were beaten back either in brutal hand-to-hand fighting or with a combination of all available resources. Isolated penetrations were countered with assembled reserves. In the sector held by Grenadier Regiment 437, however, the enemy was successful in penetrating the forefront of the bridgehead and was able to enlarge the penetration to the south for a total of 300 metres. The counter-attack by the reserves remained mired and ineffective in the face of massive fire support from enemy artillery and advancing tanks. During the night, 19 enemy tanks were destroyed in close combat. Feldwebel Rhein of the 7th Company, Grenadier Regiment 436, distinguished himself by personally destroying 2 of the enemy tanks, then assumed leadership of the company after the commander was severely wounded. Leading the company against an overwhelming enemy, he beat back the Soviet attempts to sever the line and split the seam between the 2 regiments' sectors. His bravery and skill proved to be invaluable in preventing the regiments from being cut off and possibly annihilated. On the 13th of August at 0430, the Russians again struck the line and, following an initial success in pushing back the German defenders, were unable to further penetrate the line held by the surviving Lancers. At 0600, we counterattacked against overwhelmingly superior enemy forces, supported by heavy artillery blocking fire, but were able to make little progress in restoring the line to our old positions. As our own attack ground to a halt, the enemy again struck with renewed strength, penetrating the defences with concentrated armour under heavy artillery support. As the battle pivoted back and forth through the shattered forests and swamps, the Soviets were able to break through to the south and occupy the area northeast of Porichai. Again our regiment was thrown into the attack. In vicious fighting that lasted throughout the day, we finally succeeded in bringing the Soviet advance to a halt at 1700 and recaptured the Porichai sector. After suffering numerous casualties, the Russians were stopped along the ridge marked as 54.1, approximately 200 metres south of Barskoye Lake. This effort required the use of the last reserves of men and material and was successful only after heavy fighting throughout the afternoon. The following day, the 2nd Battalion, 1st Grenadier Regiment, Reconnaissance Battalion 132, Pionnier Battalion 132, and parts of the 3 Battalion, Grenadier Regiment 437, were pulled out of the line. Immediately reorganised into Group Schmidt, they were thrust back into action to recapture the sections of the main battle line along an area referred to in the reports as the Sandkaule. Despite heavy blocking fire from Soviet batteries, the attack won ground, and the units assigned to the left and right wings soon reached their objectives. The Russians counterattacked with massive airstrikes supported by artillery bombardments and concentrated armoured units. Despite its initial successes, it was deemed necessary to withdraw Group Schmidt in the face of overwhelming opposition, leaving the Sandkaule heights to the enemy. In the afternoon, the enemy responded to the withdrawal of Group Schmidt with another assault. Despite the constant action experienced by the group throughout the day, they were successful in repelling the enemy strike and were able to push the Soviet forces back. During the fighting, the group remained under almost constant attack from enemy fighter bombers that dropped anti-personnel bombs and fired into the attacking Lancers with board weapons. The evening saw the main battle line still in our hands, although the Soviet forces had paid heavily in their attempts to break through and encircle our beleaguered units. The enemy used the night to reassemble his forces. Sounds of activity reverberated through the forests as the whine of Ford engines, accompanied by the rumble of T-34 tanks, was heard moving forward through the Soviet positions. The Lancers resupplied their ammunition, bandaged the wounded, sent the severely wounded to the rear, and waited expectantly for what they instinctively sensed the following day would bring. In the early morning hours, silence fell on the vast expanse of forest. Exhausted soldiers lay behind makeshift barricades or crouched in hastily dug foxholes and attempted to sleep. In the grey light of dawn, the snipers crawled forward and searched the ghastly landscape through rifle scopes for any hint of movement. With trained eyes pressed to the rubber ring shielding their optics, they slowly swept their field of fire from left to right, right to left, methodically following a mental grid, leaving no twig, no splintered tree, no parcel of torn earth unseen before them. On this morning, the snipers' rifles remained silent. No enemy reconnaissance troops ventured forth, and no sentries were placed. No Soviet snipers came forward to oppose ours in deadly duels. For the troops waiting behind the barricades, the silence that had descended upon the line remained a mixed, possibly ominous signal. The Russians were not digging in. The sun had climbed above the treetops when, at 0900, the aircraft swept down on our positions. Bombs burst among the hidden ranks of defenders, followed by the sharp crack of mortar rounds exploding on preset targets. The Lancers wormed their way deeper into the protection of the barricades, pressed themselves against the earth, and waited for the barrage to lift. After long minutes, the explosions subsided and the attack was launched. The grey-green figures sprang from the recesses of their foxholes, grasped machine guns and carbines, prepared the priming cords, and stacked their supplies of hand grenades, and met the assault. With massed waves of infantry, the Soviets broke through the thinly held line in two sectors. Attempting a giant pincer movement, they thrust forward toward Schlossberg, Baracken, and the Jewish cemetery. Despite the artillery barrages and fighter-bomber attacks, the Lancers were successful in halting the advance. The 2nd Company, Grenadier Regiment 437, distinguished itself in repelling this enemy assault, which had penetrated into the Narsia sector to the west of Geisterwaldchen and was attempting to strike to the south. Nevertheless, we saw that it was now necessary to withdraw our forces from the Sandkaula heights. During the night of 15th of August, the Lancers were withdrawn and hastily used to augment the Field Replacement Battalion. With this move, it became apparent that the Poritche bridgehead was to be evacuated to avoid encirclement of the forces still holding their positions on the line. During the night of 16th of August, the withdrawal was put into motion and the positions were abandoned, save a 100-metre wide section east of the Nasia. The evacuation was completed by 0230. With this withdrawal to terrain that offered better defences, the threat of breakthrough was temporarily halted, despite our having surrendered ground. The main battle line remained unbroken throughout the sector held by the division, and the numerous attempts by the Soviets to penetrate the defences ground to a halt. In preparation for withdrawing the 132 Days Infantry Division from the line, the 1st Infantry Division relieved the badly mauled Grenadier Regiment 437 in the early morning hours of the 16th of August. The 132 Days Infantry Division began withdrawing from the positions that evening, having been officially relieved on the line by the 254th Infantry Division. Reduced by casualties and exhausted to the point of incoherence, the Grenadiers had successfully defended the line through almost 7 days and nights of uninterrupted combat against overwhelming odds. With this final withdrawal, the participation of the 132 Days Infantry Division in the Poritche bridgehead drew to a close. During the course of this battle, the enemy had thrust these divisions and armoured units into the battle. 364th Rifle Division, parts of 3 regiments, 374th Rifle Division, 2 regiments, 165th Rifle Division, 2 regiments, 378th Rifle Division, 2 regiments, 311th Rifle Division, 1 regiment, 256th Rifle Division, 1 regiment, 503 Days Armoured Battalion, 14 tanks, 35th Armoured Regiment, 15 tanks, 50th Armoured Regiment, 15 tanks, 77th Independent Engineer Battalion. 12 to 14 enemy battalions were reported as decimated. 24 tanks were destroyed, 10 of which were knocked out in close combat with light weapons. The Russians had suffered extremely high casualties during the intensive Soviet attempts to break the defence line. With the withdrawal of our division, the battle south of Lake Ladoga came to an end. At 0800, the 18th of August, General Lindemann turned over command of the 132 Days Infantry Division to his replacement, General Major Wagner. Simultaneously, the sector held by that division was officially turned over to the 254th Infantry Division, 132nd Infantry Division, Division Headquarters, Commanding General, the 18th of August, 1943. Soldiers of the 132nd Infantry Division. Called to other duties and responsibilities, I have today relinquished command of the division, which I have had the honour to lead since the 5th of January 1942. I reflect back upon this period of time with immense pride and satisfaction. In every battle, in each engagement, we remained victorious. In attack, we defeated the enemy forces, often to their total destruction. In defence, we remained the lords of the battlefield, never having once lost an artillery piece to the enemy. Welded together into 6 battalions following the battle for Sevastopol, the division struck the enemy again in January 1942. Fighting through ice and snow, through mud and rain, we defeated the enemy during the winter battle of Feodosia and pushed them to the sea. After many victories during the defensive battles from February to April 1942 in the area of Daln-Kamishki, the division broke through the line on the Parpach position on the 8th of May and thrust rapidly ahead from Kamish-Burun to the harbour of Kerch, where we witnessed the last enemy transports fleeing before us. On the 7th of June 1942, the division was transferred to the north front of Sevastopol to assault the Oelberg. The Neuhaus Heights were taken while fighting fiercely under the most adverse conditions. With the assault on the bastion, the armoured battery Maxim Gorky, considered the most modern and strongly defended battery that existed at that time, and the capture of Fort Shishkova, the entire northern fortress system fell to our forces. After our push through to the battery tongue on the north edge of the harbour, the division struck toward the west over the Chernaya, and on the 1st of July captured the city with an unparalleled and daring sweep from the south. With this success, the special report was issued announcing the fall of the mighty fortress. The division was then transferred to northern Russia, where the brave regiments immediately engaged 7 Soviet divisions in brutal combat throughout September 1942 in the swamps and forests of the Gaitolovo pocket. During this phase of bloody fighting, all breakthrough attempts by the Soviets were successfully repelled. In the defensive Battle of Smedenia in February 1943, an overwhelming force of 5 Russian divisions, 2 armoured brigades and 2 rifle brigades collapsed against the iron defences of the division. The enemy losses exceeded 75 tanks due to the steadfast defence exhibited by the brave men of the division while facing an overwhelming enemy. During the last days of my command, the division successfully repelled all attempts by the enemy to break the main defence line during the 3rd battle south of Lake Ladoga. Despite the heavy artillery and mortar bombardments, despite the endless attacks by enemy aircraft which occurred day and night, the brave men of all the division's units successfully repelled every enemy attack, inflicting grave losses upon an overwhelming enemy force. Whenever called upon, the junior officers and non-commissioned officers successfully met every challenge, repelling and often totally destroying the enemy forces opposing them. The iron curtain of protection provided by our artillery units never failed us in the heat of battle, and through their skill and professional abilities they were able to repel the most aggressive foe, including armoured units. The enemy forces were often demoralised or destroyed by our artillery prior to coming within range of our infantry weapons, thus sparing our infantry numerous casualties that otherwise would have been inflicted without this support. Our anti-tank units, through skillful use of various weapons, were successful in the destruction of 24 enemy tanks, of which 7 fell to the infantry in close combat. This feat deserves my special recognition. Also, in these instances, the victory in defence lay with us. Soldiers! On the march through the waterless steppes of southern Russia, during the fighting in the ice-covered or burning heights of Sevastopol, or upon the plains of the Kerch Peninsula, in the mud and swamps of Gaitolovo, through the hip-deep snow of Smedenia, and in the pock-marked terrain south of Lake Ladoga and the Nasia, you have accomplished the seemingly impossible. My unending gratitude and my special recognition go out to my exemplary commanders, whose names shall be eternally recognized in the history of the division, as well as to the officers and non-commissioned officers, the independent fighters who held steadfast against all odds, and whose countless deeds often remained unwitnessed and unspoken, but were of decisive importance to our survival and to our subsequent victories. I thank all branches of service for your endurance and your selfless comradeship. I now take leave of a division that has been welded together through the heat of battle experienced in the expanses of Russia, and my thoughts remain with our 4,520 dead, who sleep their eternal rest on the banks of the Dnieper, on the battlefields of the Crimea, and in the contested forests to the south of Lake Ladoga. I know that the closing words I once issued with my very first daily order as new division commander, "Trust for the trustworthy," have been echoed many times. I depart from my old division with the unbreakable bonds of comradeship and unity of spirit. I wish the division and each and every member the very best soldier's luck, and I close with the recognition: the 132nd Infantry Division. Hurrah! All for Germany! Signed. Lindemann, General Lieutenant and Division Commander. Screams of the enemy wounded broke forth, and I rolled into the trench, falling directly on a wounded Russian. August 1943. Nasia Grund, Sandkaule, Jewish Cemetery, Geisterwald, Poritschai, Voronovo. Those are the names of insignificant battlefields that remained burned into the memories of those who survived. Sweeping back and forth, the deadly contests raged for days, weeks, and months throughout the forests and swamps near Leningrad. This was a killing ground where many thousands of men and machines were pitted against one another, the soldiers killed without remorse or mercy over hotly contested, jagged terrain. Small road crossings were defended to the last bullet. A small rise in the swampy terrain would suddenly gain importance and become a citadel where the combatants fought bitterly to the end. In this tangled jungle, uncounted brave souls died and were lost forever in unmarked graves. At one time there was a dense green forest with thick undergrowth and majestic pines. The air was filled with the singing of birds from the lush undergrowth and from high in the tops of the stands of birch and alder trees. Then came the armies. The earth was torn and overturned by an endless hail of bombs and artillery shells. The fresh green of the forest no longer dared show itself, lest it be destroyed again. Nature turned its face in anguish from the scene of grenade and bomb craters, of thick tree trunks splintered from machine-gun bursts, of expanses of woods set alight by tracer bullets, leaving only blackened posts through which men dashed headlong into battle, straining beneath loads of war material, carbines and submachine guns, linen sacks filled with the deadly weight of hand grenades, steel grey-green canisters of belted machine-gun ammunition, anti-tank weapons and mines. In desperation, they dodged the shell bursts and sought the very shelter they had stripped from the earth. Ragged limbs of dying trees pointed agonizingly toward the heavens, void of all growth and life in this man-made hell. Through skies clouded with the smoke and dust of battle, the sun appeared only as an orange glow as it tried to penetrate air choked with debris. There was once a stream, crystal clear, winding its way through this land to join the river Volchov, eventually meeting Lake Ladoga. In previous years, the intelligentsia and wealthy visitors from Petersburg would come to enjoy the lush forest canopies, to escape the heat and oppression of August in the city. Now the Nasia's land was crushed and torn, the once clear-running stream choked and muddy, tormented and poisoned by the dead lying thick in the forests, the ugly debris of war. The green meadows fed by clear water were now muddy swamps, churned and spoiled by the evil that had befallen this place. The crisp air was heavy and putrid with the stench of dead soldiers and horses, grotesquely swollen in the summer heat. There was once a village, marked by picturesque wooden cottages and houses with slate roofs sporting a layer of soft moss. The windows were framed with carefully fitted shutters and window panes, finely carved with stylized Russian ornamentation cut long ago. The houses typically had a covered entrance lined with benches. Here would sit Gregor and Ivan with Dunya and Tamara in the evenings, smoking papyrosi and gazing at the evening sky, the same sky described so well by Nikolai Gogol in Dead Souls. Then came the soldiers. First, the dwelling was destroyed, with only an ugly black mound remaining, the chimney rising awkwardly and painfully from the ashes. An explosive projectile fired from a distant Russian gun soon brought the chimney and oven crashing to earth, adding the rubble of burnt brick and mortar to the blackened ruins. The ruins were then occupied by a half-dozen lancers. They hastily removed the entrenching tools from their belts and hacked at the earth, burrowing deep beneath the blackened timbers and ashes. They then stacked the bricks from the destroyed chimney and carried bits of shattered tree trunks to reinforce their position. With the skill and expertise learned from many previous battles, they constructed their fortress facing the east and created gun positions from the ruins. When their afternoon of labour met their satisfaction, they carefully positioned their machine gun and readied hand grenades by removing the safety cap from the base of the wooden handles, then stacked them in a neat pyramid nearby. They opened cases of ammunition, inspected and loaded flare pistols. They then waited for the darkness when they would face the next attack. During the night, the darkness was suddenly shattered by explosions. Muzzle flashes illuminated the positions of ghost-like figures moving rapidly through the wooded glade. The lancers grasped hand grenades and crouched behind their machine gun, with hearts pounding and terror gripping their limbs. Suddenly, Russian submachine gun bullets snapped and whistled over their helmets. In one motion, the machine gun crew pulled the primer cords from their grenades, lobbed them into the darkness, and waited expectantly. The blasts of the grenades swept over the tiny cluster of figures, accompanied by the screaming of a wounded Russian. Grasping the machine gun, the crew leader fired a ripping burst into the darkness. The others joined in with carbines and submachine guns. The screams grew faint, and the terrifying sound of bodies crashing through the undergrowth was heard as the enemy patrol retreated. In the ghostly light of magnesium flares, the silhouettes of the attackers faded into darkness. The probe was momentarily repulsed. The grenadiers crouched in their holes and prepared for the next onslaught, and over the broken terrain drifted the unmistakable throbbing sound of engines. Tanks were coming. The German artillery batteries began firing salvos over the ruins into the enemy positions. The explosions of heavy-caliber shells drowned the whine of engines and the grinding of the heavy steel tracks. The Russian armour slowed, then hesitated and waited. With dawn came a barrage crashing from the barrels of more than 1,000 enemy guns. The Russians commanded the skies, and Soviet aircraft dropped anti-personnel bombs and strafed the German positions with machine guns and cannon. The lancers pressed themselves tightly against the earth. Huge chunks of brick and stone flew through the air. The dirt walls of the positions collapsed on the heavy field grey helmets of the grenadiers. The earth shook and trembled in agony. A soldier pulled his helmet over his face in a vain attempt to end the nightmare, to hear nothing, see nothing, feel nothing. At this moment, gunloader Gregor Bogatkin of the Soviet Baltic Front slammed another 152 mm projectile into the already hot breech of his howitzer. The attack was launched by the 364th Guards Division and 35th Armoured Regiment. The projectile screamed through the air, slammed into the earth and exploded, burying 4 cowering soldiers in field grey beneath earth and debris. Only a crater remained where the 4 had crouched in their position. From the earth protruded a single hand, half opened, gold wedding ring gleaming lightly. As the barrage of artillery fire and salvos of rockets crept forward, the 2 remaining survivors of the 6-man crew who had burrowed deep into the ruins caught their breath and began to move. They found themselves lying on their MG, half buried in sand and stones. Their tiny earthwork had collapsed beneath the pounding barrage. Through the forest, they clearly detected the ominous, familiar sound of rumbling engines. The Russians were coming, with tanks, T-34S, accompanied by infantry. The dim silhouettes broke forth into the clearing from the forest's edge. The two attempted to fire their MG, the same weapon that had so faithfully protected them in battles past. Instead of the rapid, ripping burst so characteristic of the German automatic weapons, only one isolated shot left the barrel, then silence, a jammed feed tray. The sensitive feeding mechanism was choked with sand from the shell bursts. The gun leader spun the gun about, and both men frantically attempted to work the bolt free. Bracing their weight against the weapon, they desperately attempted to clear the chamber and force the charging handle to the rear with their heavy infantry boots. The mechanism remained frozen in place. The clatter of the tracks grew louder as the enemy neared. The hurrah of the attacking infantry approached ever closer. One of the lancers sprang to his feet and dashed toward the other position to locate another weapon, but there he found only an empty crater, at the edge of which a lone hand was projecting from the earth. At this moment, Gunner Sergeant Ivan Chernikov, in the lead tank of the 35th Soviet Mechanized Brigade, squeezed the trigger of his 76 mm cannon. The shell ripped through both of the German's legs below the knees. With a scream, the grenadier slammed to the earth and cried for help. No one heard the screams, and he crawled toward the rear, dragging the stumps of his legs behind him. The tank reached the now defenseless position. 2 stick grenades exploded harmlessly beneath the heavy tracks. The tank rolled over the MG nest, paused, and with rumbling engines, it turned on its tracks, crushing the whole, burying from sight all traces of the desperately defended position. The T-34 rocked forward and pushed on through the German line until it, too, met its destiny. An 88 mm projectile from a hidden Tiger lying in wait beneath heavy branches and foliage ripped through the turret of the Russian tank, tearing it from the chassis, and the massive vehicle began to burn. The forest reverberated with the angry sound of small arms fire, which slowly subsided. Another attack had been stopped. The 1st Battalion was no longer reporting. Shells rained on the headquarters and buried the battalion commander, Hauptmann Gussel, and the adjutant, Lieutenant Vogel, together with their staff. The communications equipment was smashed. The radio men were dead. Scores of wounded staggered or crawled toward the rear, or were carried in shelter quarters by lancers stumbling through a hail of artillery and Katyusha fire toward the regimental aid station. Hurriedly, I briefed the small remaining group of lancers and prepared to launch a counterattack with the regimental reserve, which now consisted solely of a combined infantry pioneer platoon. Moving rapidly through the deafening din of battle, we dashed from shell crater to shell crater, battling with submachine guns and hand grenades until we reached the Sandkaula. There we took a number of benumbed Russians prisoner, many of whom were wounded and unable to retreat. The night brought no rest. Flares sizzled across the sky and illuminated the tortured land in a silver light, showing the way for the Russian bombers to bring their loads of death. The Jewish cemetery was defended by a small group of lancers led by Hauptmann Scheckenbach, and Russian assault troops infiltrated behind them. During the night, our couriers and ammunition supply carriers received sporadic fire from the darkness. I selected 2 groups of the old hares to take with me, names I had come to know well, men whom I knew would never falter: Kammermeier, Herfellner, Obermeier, Juckel, Mackelsdorfer, Mackinger, Feuerstein, Wagner, Ganser, Martin, Holtzmann, Kurz, Dozer, Hack, Hipp, and others. We quickly prepared ourselves for action, stuffing our boots and belts with hand grenades and spare submachine gun magazines. 3 light machine guns were slung from the hip. Several canteens were passed through the tiny group at the last moment in a vain attempt to quench a nervous thirst. We plunged into the darkness and across a crater-strewn field, leaping from cover to cover, shooting into the trenches and holes, screaming and flinging hand grenades to our front, to the left and right. Furtive shadows in khaki brown darted before us, figures in olive-coloured round helmets with the small packs on their backs characteristic of the Soviet soldier. They scattered into the darkness like rabbits in the night, and we took 7 prisoners. The supply column followed our trail and located us at the Jewish cemetery. There we eagerly broke into the containers of food and ammunition, wordlessly devouring the meagre rations of cold wurst and bread. The battle raged for 7 days and nights. The regiments of the antagonists, bloodied and weary, refused to withdraw or stop to rest. To withdraw meant defeat. To halt for rest meant death. For the survivors of this hell, these swamps and forests, these jagged stumps and tortured earth would remain as burning memories of the battle from which many would escape only through death. At long last, on the 16th of August, the bulk of the division was withdrawn from the battle line south of Lake Ladoga due to heavy losses. Regiment 437 remained on the line, and on the 17th of August, Oberst Graf Schwerin von Krosigk assumed command of the 1st East Prussian Infantry Division, while it still occupied the forward positions. During the night, Oberst Kindsmiller of my regiment proceeded forward to the 11th Company's headquarters. The unit was still clinging tenaciously to its positions in the Jewish cemetery. For 7 long days of fierce fighting, and under direct fire from armoured vehicles, barrages of artillery shells and tons of bombs dropped from endless waves of aircraft, Hauptmann Scheckenbach, nicknamed Stubborn Ferdinand, had refused to yield to the overwhelming attackers on the Jewish cemetery heights. Following a Soviet breakthrough in a left sector, his position became a strongpoint and was responsible for breaking waves of attacks, thus preventing a collapse of the entire left wing. Although Soviet infantry managed to infiltrate behind the position and entrench themselves firmly among the artillery and bomb craters, the 11th Company continued to hold. During the night, Hauptmann Scheckenbach summoned his runners. Gefreiter Fleck, the 19-year-old courier of the 2nd Platoon, crawled and raced through the torn landscape from his platoon position toward the company headquarters. Although the landscape had shifted and changed appearance constantly under incessant barrages, he instinctively found his way through the darkness. Throwing himself prone on the earth and lying motionless when sizzling flares would light up the sky, Fleck eventually arrived at the headquarters, gasping for breath and soaked with sweat. Slung over his shoulders and around his neck, he carried 4 Russian submachine guns he had gathered from enemy dead strewn across the moonscape terrain as he had made his way across the contested ground. These weapons were particularly valued as trade items with rear-echelon logistics and supply personnel, and an experienced lancer was never one to pass up such an opportunity. "Our only supply line has been cut by a Russian penetration," explained Stubborn Ferdinand. The 5 couriers were given their assignment: get through the Soviet lines and return with enough food for 2 days. During this time, Oberst Kindsmiller had completed his briefing, and the 5 couriers were assigned to escort him back with them to regimental headquarters. The couriers carried 2 ration canisters per man, wearing one slung across the chest and the other strapped in a harness across the back. In addition to the German MP-40, or a captured Soviet PPSH submachine gun, they carried grenades stuck in their belts and in the tops of their boots. Thus burdened for their assignment, they plunged into the darkness, the Oberst between them in the centre of the file, carrying his stiffened left arm in the characteristic pose behind his back. Orientation became more difficult as the party slowly picked its way through the tortured landscape in the darkness. After traversing several hundred meters, the leading courier had just approached the edge of a large shell crater when a heavy machine gun exploded into action at point-blank range. Simultaneously, a flare sizzled skyward and burst, illuminating the area. Gefreiter Fleck had instinctively thrown himself prone at the instant the machine gun bullets cracked overhead. He stripped himself of the ration canisters and rolled into the shell crater to find the other 4 already in position, weapons trained over the edge, caps removed from the hand grenades. They immediately assumed that they had walked into an ambush and were prepared to give their lives only at great cost. In the brief silence that followed, they recognized hushed German voices whispering in the darkness from the direction of the machine gun position. One of the couriers shouted, "Don't shoot! It's your own people!" The machine gun remained silent. Within the crater, the men took a cursory count. Someone was missing. They called into the darkness for the Oberst and received no answer. Seconds later, the courier from the 2nd Platoon located Kindsmiller's still form lying 10 paces from the crater. The courier pulled the body upward by the shoulders and grasped the motionless officer around the chest. His hands came away sticky and warm. Immediately joining the courier, the others unbuttoned Oberst Kinsmiller's tunic and found a wound directly over the heart. The 19-year-old Gefreiter lifted his commander onto his shoulder and stumbled toward the MG position. The men of the MG crew from the neighbouring regiment could hardly imagine the catastrophe and were speechless with horror when it was revealed to them that their burst had killed their commander. The situation along the line in this sector was so precarious that all sentries had been forced to remain alert, fingers on their triggers in preparation for another attack. Just hours prior to this fatal mishap, an infiltrating Russian patrol had been repulsed at this very spot, and all noise and movement outside the line had to be considered enemy activity. This tragic incident had cost the regiment its most talented and respected leader. Oberst Kinsmiller had been with the men since the formation of the regiment in Lower Bavaria, throughout the Balkan campaign, and during the entire course of operations in Russia. His death was a heavy blow to the regiment, as well as to the division. 2 days later, he was laid to rest among his soldiers in the cemetery at Sogolubovka. It was said that the funeral was carried out with full military honours, under the direction of the division and the Army Corps. This cemetery served as the gravesite for the division through the 2 battles at Lake Ladoga, and the division medical centre had been established nearby. At the cemetery, a large birch cross was erected in the shadow of a well-preserved Greek Orthodox church. A few months later, the German army evacuated the area, and there remained no crosses to be seen on the graves of soldiers. To deny Soviet intelligence information regarding the formations involved in the vicinity, as well as to keep the names and numbers of the fallen from the enemy, military cemeteries were often stripped of any indications of burials and markers when an area was evacuated. Following the war, the Soviet government made additional efforts to eradicate any remaining signs or monuments that the invaders might have erected to honour their dead. Those who fell on the vast expanses in the east now lie in lost graves. As the army continued in its attempts to satisfy the unrelenting appetite of the battlefields for military leaders, the Feldwebels and Obergefreiters began to play a more critical role in leading and commanding the combat forces. But the eternal old Gefreiters, many of whom became non-commissioned officers, constituted the backbone of the army. A common joke circulated that reflected the tone and disposition of the Lancer on the Russian front. It was supposed that when the victorious armies would eventually return from the east, a great parade would be held in Berlin. Marching columns would be observed by thousands of onlookers lining the Unter den Linden, and the magnificent ranks in all their finery would pass beneath the Brandenburg Gate. At the forefront would ride the generals and their staffs, resplendent in polished staff vehicles, with regimental banners flying. Following closely would come the unit commanders, accompanied by their staff officers, awards gleaming on their breasts, dress swords at their sides. Behind them roll the communications vans, the supply and logistics units, smartly riding in freshly painted Köbelwagons. Then come the field artillery batteries, heavy guns pulled by rumbling half-tracks, and teams of groomed horses, all fittings polished and in perfect order. The entire procession would be led by Reichsmarschall Göring, outfitted in a resplendent white uniform piped with crimson and gold. Hanging at his throat is the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves. His entire entourage would ride in half-tracked vehicles for effect. The parade passes by, the music eventually comes to an end, and the crowd, duly impressed, starts to disperse. Suddenly, trailing the magnificent parade at a distance, a ragged Lancer, one of the eternal Gefreiters, wanders into view. His cracked and worn boots reflect the distance walked from the steppes of Russia. Wearing a tattered and faded uniform, augmented by bits and pieces of Russian military equipment, he sports a week's stubble of beard and is burdened with a gas mask, entrenching tool, mess tin, shelter quarter, rifle, and hand grenades. Battered and dented field badges pinned to his tunic indicate numerous engagements and multiple wounds suffered.